I remember the first time I started feeling something was off, but I pushed it away. I mean, you don't just wake up one morning and think, hey, my wife is probably cheating on me. That kind of thing creeps up on you, slowly, almost like it's gaslighting you into second-guessing everything. Katie and I had been married for 4 years, and like I said, I thought everything was fine. I thought we were good. Every Friday, we'd hit this local club, the same spot we'd gone to for years. It was kind of our tradition. She had her friends, I had mine, and we both drank a bit too much, laughed a lot, and went home together. The usual. But things started to feel different. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. Katie seemed more distant than usual, but that was the thing, right? It wasn't obvious. She wasn't being a complete jerk, just off. She was still laughing at my jokes, still pretending to be interested in my day, but there was something in her eyes that wasn't there before. That's when I started noticing how much she laughed around Matt, the bartender. She'd always been friendly with the staff. That's how she was. But Matt, he was different. He always seemed to linger a little too long when he talked to her. Too touchy, too casual. But hey, maybe I was just overthinking it. I mean, what guy wouldn't get a little paranoid seeing his wife laughing with some dude behind the bar, right? Katie had that way of making people feel special, like you were the only one in the room. It's one of the things that first drew me to her. But the more I watched, the more I started to wonder if Matt was getting special treatment, too. Then one night, after a few too many drinks, I was sitting at the bar, talking to Chris, a buddy of mine who worked there. We were shooting the breeze, as we usually did when I noticed something that made my stomach flip. Katie and Matt were talking across the room, laughing together. It was the kind of laughter that felt intimate. Too intimate. And just then, Chris leans over and says, "Hey, Jim, I gotta tell you something." His voice was low, and I could tell he wasn't looking me in the eye. That alone made my heart skip a beat. I asked him, "What's up?" He hesitated for a second, but then he just came out with it. "Look, I don't want to be the one to tell you this, but I've seen them, you know? Katie and Matt. They've been too friendly. It's not just the usual banter. You might want to be careful, man." It hit me like a brick. I remember just staring at him, trying to process what he'd just said. "Are you serious?" I asked, my voice sounding a lot more casual than I felt. "You're telling me Katie's sleeping with Matt?" Chris didn't directly say it, but it didn't need to be said. The look on his face said it all. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, something told me he was right. I tried to brush it off, though. "Thanks for the heads up, man, but just don't get involved, all right?" I said, trying to keep it together. My mind was already racing. What was I supposed to do with this information? Chris just nodded. "I don't want to get involved, but I'm just saying, you deserve to know." The whole night felt like a blur after that. My head was spinning, but I didn't want to make a scene. Not in front of Katie, not in front of everyone else. I tried to act normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I thought I knew was a lie. And that's how it started. The sinking feeling. The knot in my stomach. That was the moment I knew something was up, even if I didn't want to admit it. But what could I do? I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Not until I had proof. The days that followed Chris's revelation felt like I was stuck in some kind of nightmare, like I was watching everything from the outside but couldn't do anything about it. I kept replaying those moments in the club, the way Katie smiled at Matt, the way his hand rested on her shoulder just a little too long. It ate at me, gnawed away at everything I thought was real in my marriage. But instead of confronting her right then, I did the exact opposite. I became quiet, distant, and started observing. I told myself I needed proof, something concrete, before I let myself fall apart over this. So I waited. I watched. I kept my distance, made no moves to disrupt the balance. Katie went on, acting like everything was fine. She'd still get dressed up on Fridays, still kiss me goodbye with that same smile. It was almost like she had no idea I knew. But I was paying attention to every detail, every little thing. I started following her routines more closely. I noticed how often she went out with her friends now, the same group she'd always been close to. They'd all gather, laughing and talking, but Katie never seemed to stay home much anymore. I'd ask her where she was going, and she'd tell me she was meeting friends, sometimes at one of their places or at some random restaurant. No big deal. Except it became clear to me that the meetings were happening more frequently, and they weren't always with the same people. I started noticing the lies, those little things that didn't quite line up. For a while, I kept it together, tried to play the role of the oblivious husband. But inside, it was killing me. There were nights I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining Katie out there with Matt. The thought made my skin crawl, but I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop the pit in my stomach, the anger that simmered quietly under the surface. One evening, after another one of her girls' nights, I did something I told myself I wouldn't. I checked her phone. Not that I ever used to do that. It wasn't like me to invade her privacy. But this time, I couldn't help it. I went through her messages. At first, it was just harmless stuff. Texts from her friends, plans for the weekend, small talk. But then, toward the bottom, I found it. There were messages between Katie and Matt. The tone was too familiar, the language too playful. They didn't talk like friends. They talked like something more, something secret. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours. I couldn't make sense of it. I didn't want to. The last thing I wanted was for this to be true. I had to be wrong. But I wasn't. The proof was right in front of me. They talked about meeting up, about catching up after work, little inside jokes I didn't understand. I felt sick. But still, I didn't confront her. Not yet. I couldn't make myself do it. I wasn't ready to shatter everything just yet. Not until I had more, something stronger. I needed to see them together. In person, out in the open. I wanted to see it with my own eyes. Maybe that would give me the clarity I needed to act. So, I did the worst thing I could have done. I started watching her. Following her without her knowing. I'd check her location when she went out, keep tabs on her activities, even if it meant becoming someone I barely recognized. I told myself I was doing it for a reason, for justice. But honestly, I didn't care about justice. I just needed to know. The truth was, I couldn't handle the uncertainty anymore. I needed confirmation that the man she was out there with, laughing and touching her, was the same guy who had been sharing her bed behind my back. As the weeks went by, I started to feel like a stranger in my own life. I was no longer the happy husband I used to be. The guy who used to look forward to our Friday nights at the club was gone. In his place was a man consumed by the need for answers. I wasn't living in the same reality anymore. I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to return to it. But through all of this, I kept up appearances. I acted like everything was fine when she was around. I smiled when she kissed me goodbye, like I hadn't spent the last few hours searching through her phone or watching her leave with her friends. I was playing my part, waiting for the moment when I'd have everything I needed to make my move. I was starting to get good at this. Living two lives. The calm, cool husband when Katie was around, and the quiet, suspicious guy who couldn't stop thinking about every little detail. Every glance, every touch, every word she said or didn't say. It felt like I was going crazy, but I couldn't stop myself. I was so close now I could taste it. And I kept telling myself, this was the only way. Wait for the perfect moment, gather all the evidence, and then act. I wouldn't confront her until I had everything locked down. But Katie, she wasn't making it easy. The more I watched her, the more I realized how good she was at playing this game. She acted like nothing was different. She was still affectionate, still the woman I married. It was like nothing had changed. I hated her for it, but at the same time, I hated myself for not knowing sooner. How had I been so blind? How had I not seen it? How had I missed all the signs? One Friday, I decided to put my plan into action. I wasn't just going to let this happen to me. I had to be smarter than this, so I went into full-on observation mode. The night started like every other night. We went to the club, had a couple of drinks, and everything seemed normal, or as normal as it could be under the circumstances. But this time, I wasn't just observing Katie and Matt from the sidelines. I was in the middle of it. I hung around the bar more than usual. I laughed along with Katie, making sure to keep things light, to make it seem like I wasn't suspicious. But inside, I was burning. I couldn't stop thinking about Chris's words. The ones that had started this whole thing. Watching them together, seeing how she looked at him, how Matt didn't even try to hide it anymore, made something inside me snap. It was clear now. She was involved with him. The way she leaned in when he spoke, the way she'd touch his arm or laugh at his jokes a little too loudly. And the worst part? She wasn't even trying to hide it. She was acting like nothing was wrong, like there was no secret, no betrayal. I wasn't some fool. I wasn't blind anymore. At some point during the night, Matt was on the other side of the bar, out of earshot, and that's when I saw my opportunity. I pulled Katie aside, as casually as I could, and made small talk. I asked her how things were going with her friends. She smiled, told me it was fine, the usual stuff. But I wasn't really listening. I was too focused on what was coming next. The trap was set. I was finally ready to confront her. But I wasn't going to do it in the way I'd always imagined. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to make a scene, not yet. I wasn't going to be that guy. No. I had something better in mind. The next day, I pulled out the picture. It wasn't much, just a shot of her and Matt laughing together at the club one night, the kind of photo people post on social media. But I didn't need anything more. The look on her face when she saw it would tell me everything I needed to know. I didn't scream at her, didn't let the anger overtake me. I just showed her the picture, said nothing, and watched her face go white. She went silent. I could see the panic in her eyes, that moment of realization. She knew exactly what I was holding, and she knew exactly what it meant. The way she froze in place told me everything I needed to know. She didn't even try to deny it. But still, she tried to justify it. She told me it was a mistake, that it didn't mean anything. It was just one time, she said. It didn't mean anything, Jim. I'm sorry. It was a mistake. Her voice was shaky, but there was a hint of annoyance behind it, like she was annoyed I'd even found out. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The audacity. The denial. The complete lack of responsibility. I didn't shout. I didn't even argue. I simply nodded, walked out of the room, and started packing my things. That was it. The final straw. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't just walk away. I had to make her feel it. I wasn't going to let her get away with this without consequences. She'd broken me, and now I was going to break her back. I didn't waste time after that. No tears. No dramatic outbursts. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. If she thought for 1 second she could lie to me, that she could get away with this, she was wrong. I wasn't the same guy anymore. The Jim she'd known was gone. I moved out that same day. I didn't take much, just some clothes, my personal stuff. I left everything else behind, everything that once represented our life together. But I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Katie didn't chase after me. She didn't beg me to stay. I expected at least some kind of response, some guilt, something to make me feel like she actually cared. But no. It was like I was a ghost, like I just ceased to exist. That should have hurt, but honestly, it felt like a relief. I realized how far gone we really were. She didn't even try to save it. Over the next few days, I didn't speak to her. I didn't want to hear her apologies or excuses. They meant nothing to me. But the anger, the desire for revenge, that only grew stronger. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Matt, too. He wasn't going to get away with this. He thought he could have her. He thought he could walk around with his hands all over my wife and think there wouldn't be consequences. I didn't just want to confront him. I wanted to ruin him. I wanted him to feel the weight of what he'd done, and I had the perfect way to do it. I knew where he worked, and I knew that his job, his reputation, was all he had going for him. He wouldn't be the charming bartender with a flirty smile once I was done with him. I didn't go in guns blazing. That wouldn't have been my style. No, I was more calculated than that. I started with the small stuff. I dug into Matt's social media, found photos of him hanging out with Katie. Little moments, nothing too obvious, but enough to show the pattern. Then, I found a couple of things about him that weren't so public. Things that made him look not so squeaky clean. Little mistakes, little dirt I could turn into something bigger. I wasn't going to give him a chance to explain himself. I was going to make sure he had nowhere to hide. I still didn't go straight to his boss. Not yet. I had to make sure I had all the pieces in place first. I needed to be thorough. I wasn't in a rush. If there was one thing I'd learned from this whole mess, it was that patience is a powerful weapon. And I had all the time in the world. Meanwhile, Katie? She kept texting me. It started with the usual, apologies, begging me to come back, promises that she'd never do it again. I didn't reply. Not once. I wasn't angry anymore. I was beyond that. This wasn't about fixing anything. This wasn't about saving what was broken. It was about taking what she'd destroyed and making sure she could never rebuild it. And then, one evening, Katie showed up at my place. I wasn't expecting her. I wasn't looking for an explanation. But there she was, standing in my doorway, looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her face was pale, eyes red from crying. She said she was sorry again, that she never meant for it to go this far. She even tried to blame the whole thing on mistakes she'd made, on feeling lost, or whatever excuse she thought would work. I didn't let her finish. I didn't need to hear it anymore. I stood there, staring at her for a second, and then I closed the door in her face. I didn't even care that she was standing on the other side of it. I didn't care about her sobbing, her pleading, her regret. None of it mattered. Because in that moment, I realized I didn't need her anymore. The person I was now wasn't the guy who'd let himself get walked all over. And that felt good. But I still wasn't done. Not even close. Katie didn't give up after that. For days, she bombarded me with messages and calls, hoping I'd break. She'd send texts about how sorry she was, about how she'd made a huge mistake, how she never meant to hurt me. She begged me to meet her, to talk things through. But by that point, there was nothing left to say. The words she'd already said were enough to show me who she really was. There was nothing to fix. I started to feel this strange calmness in me, like I was finally in control of my own life again. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't reacting to her. I wasn't living in the chaos she'd created. I was making decisions, planning, taking action. And that's when I realized I wasn't just doing this to hurt her. I wasn't just doing this to hurt Matt, either. I was doing it for me. I went through our old messages, old pictures, anything that might have some value. Some of the stuff I found made me sick, but it was all part of the process. I needed to see it, to remind myself of what she'd done. I wasn't going to pretend it hadn't happened, or that I could just forget it. No, I was going to use every last detail to make sure they both understood the weight of what they'd done. It was time to move forward. Katie had thought she could just apologize and everything would go back to normal. She was wrong. I started with the house. I took everything I wanted. My things, my memories, anything that felt like mine and not some shared illusion. I didn't care about the furniture, the kitchen appliances, or the decorations we'd picked together. What mattered to me were the things that actually belonged to me, the personal items, the things I'd worked for, the things that still reminded me of who I was before this whole mess started. Katie had tried to hide behind apologies, but she couldn't hide from the truth. The truth was, she had betrayed me. She had chosen him over me. So, I wasn't going to let her walk away with her life still intact. She needed to feel the consequences, and I wasn't going to let it go until I knew she did. Once I'd cleared out my things, I sent the photos. It was methodical. I didn't rush. I sent them to her friends, her family, everyone who mattered to her. I showed them the photos of her and Matt, the ones where they looked way too close for comfort. I didn't just send those pictures, though. I sent the details, the lies she'd told. I showed her friends how she'd claimed she was at a friend's house when she was really out with him. I even included some of the texts I'd found. I wasn't letting her get away with the narrative she'd been spinning. It wasn't just about humiliating her, though. I wasn't doing it to satisfy some petty need for revenge. I was doing it because I needed her to know how much she had hurt me. I wanted her to realize that this wasn't something she could hide. I wanted the world to see what she'd done. I wasn't going to let her cover it up. I wasn't going to let her get away with destroying everything we'd built. And then there was Matt. He wasn't just some random guy in the club anymore. No, he had become the person who thought he could destroy my life without any consequences. He had no idea who he was messing with. I wasn't the guy who would just sit back and accept his betrayal. I found his boss's contact info. No easy task, but I wasn't exactly going to make it easy for him, was I? I sent a message, an anonymous note, with all the details I'd gathered. I didn't just tell them about his affair with a married woman. I made sure to highlight that he'd been lying to his coworkers and that his behavior had the potential to tarnish their business's reputation. It wasn't a direct threat, but it was a warning. I made it clear that people were watching, that his actions had consequences, and that maybe he shouldn't feel so untouchable anymore. When I was done, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had taken control of the situation in a way I never thought I could. I wasn't some emotional wreck anymore. I wasn't the guy who had to beg for answers or wait for Katie to tell me the truth. I had made sure that they would never forget what they'd done. Katie tried to reach out again, but this time, I didn't even look at her messages. I had no interest in hearing her voice. I was done with her, done with the lies. The woman who had been my wife was gone, replaced by someone who thought she could get away with betrayal without facing any consequences. She was wrong. And as for Matt, he had no idea what was coming for him. I wasn't done with him. Not yet. It wasn't enough. Not yet. When I sent those messages, I felt like I was taking back some of what she'd stolen from me. But there was a gnawing feeling inside me, Like I hadn't done enough to make them both really understand. I wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. I'd started something, and now I had to see it through. I wanted them to feel the weight of their choices, the weight of the lies they thought they could get away with. I wanted them to know that I wasn't the same guy I used to be, the guy who would just get hurt and move on. No, I was taking control, and they would pay for what they'd done. Katie didn't get it. She kept reaching out, sending me texts begging for forgiveness, for a second chance. I could see in every word how much she regretted it, not because she was sorry for what she'd done to me, but because she was realizing the consequences of her actions. But there was no way I was going to let her back in. Not after everything. She tried calling a few times too. The first couple of calls, I let it ring out. After that, I just blocked her number. I didn't even need to hear her voice anymore. She'd lost me. Completely. I think that was the hardest part for her, realizing she had no power over me anymore. When she found out I'd taken the house and sent the photos, she lost it. I heard from her friend, someone I used to consider a mutual friend, that Katie was furious. But what could she say? There was no excuse. She'd done this to herself. But it wasn't just her I was focusing on now. It was Matt. He'd thought this was some casual fling, something that could stay in the shadows, hidden in the bar. He thought he could just play around with a married woman without facing any real consequences. But I wasn't going to let him keep his job, keep his life, like everything was fine. I wasn't the kind of guy who needed a big confrontation. I didn't need to punch him or make threats. I had something much more effective. Quiet destruction. I kept a low profile. I didn't act out in anger, didn't show up at the club with a scene. I didn't need to. Instead, I kept digging into Matt's life. I didn't just stop at his work, at the messages I'd already sent. I started looking into his past. The guy had a history, a few blemishes that weren't immediately obvious but were enough to paint a picture of who he really was. Nothing major, just enough to make him look like the kind of guy who wouldn't be trustworthy in any part of his life, let alone in a job that involved dealing with customers and the reputation of the bar. I found a few things that could do some damage. I wasn't just looking for gossip. I was looking for the kind of information that would make people question his integrity. I found a couple of old posts, some social media comments, and a few connections that made him look less than professional. I wasn't trying to ruin his life outright, but I wasn't going to let him think he could get away with this without consequences either. I wrote one last note to his boss. This time, it wasn't just about the affair. It was about who Matt was, the kind of guy he was when no one was looking. I mentioned the professional behavior he'd shown at work, how he'd been seen flirting with married women and talking about his conquests with people at the bar. I didn't threaten anything, I just presented the facts, letting them speak for themselves. I wasn't expecting them to fire him immediately, but I didn't care. I knew they'd start looking at him differently. They'd start questioning his character. It wasn't about getting him fired on the spot. It was about planting that seed of doubt, making sure he couldn't walk into that bar like nothing had changed. And sure enough, a couple of days later, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Matt was acting different. He was walking around the club with a nervous energy, like he could feel something was about to hit him, but he didn't know what. I knew the boss had received the message, and the tension was starting to eat away at him. But I didn't stop there. I had one final step to complete. I went to Katie's work. Not to talk to her, not to try to get her to feel sorry for me, but because I knew she was close with some of her coworkers, and I knew they all liked her. I was careful. I didn't want to make it obvious I was there to cause a scene. I just dropped by, pretending like everything was fine. I picked up a coffee, sat down in the cafe area, and started talking to a couple of her colleagues. Eventually, one of them mentioned Katie. They didn't know what had happened between us. None of them had any idea what I knew. But I wasn't there to spill the details. I just made sure to casually drop in that Katie had been, well, not exactly faithful to her husband. I didn't give them every detail. I didn't have to. I just made sure they knew enough to whisper behind her back. I didn't want her to get sympathy. I didn't want her to walk around acting like she was the victim. No, I wanted to make sure that every corner of her life felt uncomfortable. I wanted her to understand that there was no escaping the truth. And as the days went on, I started to see the cracks. Katie and Matt were both unraveling. Katie's friends stopped answering her calls. Matt started getting more uncomfortable at work. The tension, the guilt, it was all beginning to catch up with them. They thought they could live their lives without any consequences. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't made a scene. I hadn't even let them see the anger in me. I'd done something far worse. I made sure they felt it, in every part of their lives, without even realizing what was happening. And that, I realized, was the most satisfying part of all. It wasn't over yet. No matter how much I'd done to get back at Katie and Matt, the feeling of satisfaction didn't last as long as I thought it would. Sure, there was a certain thrill in watching them squirm. But after a while, it all felt empty. I'd ruined their lives, and they knew it. But the truth was, I was still carrying around this heavy weight inside me. I hadn't really moved on, not fully. I still had that anger, that gnawing need for closure, that I hadn't gotten yet. I kept seeing Katie's face, pale, pleading, desperate for me to forgive her. I remembered how she looked when I showed her that picture of her and Matt. She thought she could talk her way out of it. But in the end, it wasn't about her getting back in my good graces. It was about me being able to look at myself in the mirror again, knowing that I didn't let her walk all over me. But what was the point of all of it? Sure, they were both miserable now, but did that make me feel better? Honestly, it didn't. I'd done what I thought would make everything right. Made them feel the consequences of their betrayal. And I had, in ways that they'd never forget. But now, I couldn't shake the feeling that the revenge I'd worked so hard for didn't really fix anything. It didn't give me back what I lost. It didn't take away the hurt that had settled in my chest like a lead weight. Matt. He didn't last long at the club after that. Word spread fast about his behavior, about the affair. His boss gave him the cold shoulder. His coworkers started pulling back from him. After a few weeks of tension and whispers, he was out of a job. I didn't need to lift a finger to make that happen. He'd already dug his own grave. But the best part? The look on his face when he realized he'd been exposed. He wasn't laughing anymore when he saw me around the club. He didn't even make eye contact anymore. I could tell he was scared. He wasn't the cocky, confident bartender he used to be. He was a man who had lost everything, and it was only a matter of time before he realized the full extent of his consequences. As for Katie, well, things got worse for her, too. Her friends, the ones who had always been there for her, started pulling away. The ones who used to listen to her complaints about me and offer their sympathy? They were gone. A lot of them unfriended her on social media. Some of them started distancing themselves from her at work. And the ones who stayed, they didn't exactly look at her the same way anymore. The trust was broken, and it wasn't something she could rebuild so easily. But even after everything I'd done to them, part of me still felt hollow. Like all this effort to tear them down, all this planning, wasn't enough to fill the hole she'd left behind. I thought revenge would make me feel like I was taking my power back. But the truth was, it was just a temporary fix. I was still broken, still torn up about everything that had happened. I realized I was never going to get closure from them. Katie was never going to sit down with me and admit she had destroyed everything. Matt was never going to apologize for being the man who took advantage of my marriage. I wasn't going to get a confession, a deep regret, or some apology that would make me feel like I could finally move on. So, I did the one thing I could do for myself. I started moving forward. Slowly, but surely, I started to reclaim the parts of myself I'd lost. I started focusing on my own life, on the things that used to make me happy. I went to the gym more, hung out with friends who had been there for me when all of this came crashing down. I didn't need to hang on to the anger anymore. It was exhausting. It wasn't going to bring me peace. Katie, Matt, they'd both gotten what they deserved. But now, it was my turn to rebuild. I realized I couldn't live my life as a victim, as someone obsessed with revenge. I had to find a way to heal, even if that meant letting go of the last piece of my old life that I thought I could save. The last time I saw Katie was when she showed up at my apartment a month or so after everything had blown up. She came to apologize one last time, but this time, I wasn't the same person I was before. I wasn't angry. I wasn't emotional. I was done. I looked at her, and I just shook my head. I didn't need her apology. I didn't need anything from her anymore. I was already moving on. Time has a funny way of shifting things. What felt all-consuming in the beginning, the anger, the hurt, the constant need to get even, eventually faded into something quieter. It didn't happen overnight, but it happened. I started realizing that revenge, as sweet as it may have seemed at the time, wasn't the answer. It didn't heal me. It didn't bring me closure. It didn't bring me peace. It was a little over 3 months after the blow-up, and things started to settle. Katie was still trying to put on a brave face. I heard from a mutual friend that she was seeing someone new, some guy she met at work. And I didn't feel anything. Not jealousy, not anger. Just a weird sort of indifference. At one point, I would have cared. I would have wanted to see her suffer, to know that she was falling apart like I had. But now, it didn't matter anymore. Her life was no longer connected to mine. She was someone else's problem now. Matt, on the other hand, was having a rough time. I saw him around the club a few times, always looking smaller somehow. Like someone had deflated him. He had that look in his eyes, the one of someone who was trying to hold onto a sliver of pride, but was failing miserably. His reputation at the bar was in ruins. The customers who used to laugh and flirt with him avoided him. His co-workers treated him like he was radioactive. He wasn't the guy with the charm anymore. He was just a reminder of a mistake everyone wanted to forget. I'm sure that stung. But honestly, I wasn't paying attention to him anymore. It wasn't my problem. And that was the moment of clarity I needed. It's not my problem anymore. I wasn't going to keep my life tied to what they did. They didn't get to have any more power over me. Revenge had been a means to an end, but now that I'd seen the consequences play out, I realized that letting go was the only way to really heal. I started seeing a therapist after that. I know, it sounds cliché. A guy with a broken heart turns to therapy. But you know what? It helped. I wasn't going in there to talk about Katie or Matt, though. I was going in there to talk about me. To figure out who I was now that the life I thought I knew was shattered. It wasn't easy. It wasn't fast. But slowly, I began to rebuild. Not just the broken pieces of my trust, but my confidence, my sense of self. I had been so wrapped up in the idea of revenge that I forgot about the most important thing: taking care of myself. One thing that came up in therapy that really stuck with me was this idea of acceptance. It wasn't about letting them off the hook. It wasn't about forgiving them, at least not right away. It was about accepting what had happened and accepting that there was no way to change it. And by accepting that, I could stop carrying around the weight of it all. I could stop letting them take up space in my head. I started dating again, though it was nothing serious at first. Just casual, nothing to get too invested in. I wasn't looking for a replacement for Katie, or some kind of distraction. I was just testing the waters again, seeing what it felt like to enjoy someone's company without constantly comparing them to what I'd had before. And honestly, it felt good. It felt like I was finally living again, like the cloud that had been hovering over me for months was finally starting to lift. And that's when I realized something important. The revenge I'd gotten? It hadn't fixed anything. It hadn't taken away the pain, and it hadn't brought me any peace. But what had been healing me all along was moving on. It was letting go of the past. It was giving myself the freedom to make new memories, to find new happiness, without being chained to the betrayal that used to define me. Katie and Matt. I stopped thinking about them so much. I still heard whispers here and there about their lives, but I didn't care. They were both going through their own struggles. It was sad in a way, but it didn't affect me anymore. They were two people who made choices that led to their own consequences. And while I had a part in making those consequences sting a little more, it wasn't my responsibility to fix or punish them anymore. They weren't my problem. As for me, I was starting to feel like I was me again. Not the guy who was cheated on, not the guy who spent months plotting revenge. Just Jim. The guy who could laugh without the bitterness behind it. The guy who could smile without constantly watching his back. I didn't have to live in the shadows of the past. I could move forward with the knowledge that I was stronger now, that I had survived this, and that I could still find happiness again. In the end, I didn't need their apologies. I didn't need to make sure they paid for what they did. The best revenge was living my life, not as their victim, but as someone who had rebuilt, who had taken the worst that life threw at him and turned it into something better. I didn't need anything from them anymore. I just needed to be free.